Ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you all for this afternoon's book discussion on the Indian Ocean. So we have the new book here by Frédéric Grare and Jean-Loup Samaan. I hope I got the French names right. So it is book is called The Indian Ocean as a New Political and Security Region. Frédéric has been he's a senior fellow at the European Council on Foreign Affairs. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Jean-Loup is here, a senior research fellow at the Middle East Institute of the National University of Singapore, and is also associated with the French Institute of International Relations, or IFRI, right? I mean, so I'm not going to give a longer introduction to the two speakers. Both of them have been in the region for a long time, and they're quite familiar with the historical evolution as well as the current dynamics of the Indian Ocean. Firstly, let me say that books on Indian Ocean are rare these days because the industry has moved to Indo-Pacific. That the whole focus is so much on the Indo-Pacific. It's often Indian Ocean is seen as simply subsumed by the debate on the Indo-Pacific. But I think it's important, I think, to look at Indian Ocean on its own right as well, because if Indian Ocean itself was a large entity, which one of the things the book argues cannot be constituted under a single security architecture, the Indo-Pacific is even more broader, so therefore even more harder to pin down. I think what the book looks at, I would say, what we might call a third phase in the evolution of the Indian Ocean over the last 200 years, if you will. You had a phase from 1820s onwards till 1947, when the post-Napoleonic Wars saw the transformation of the Indian Ocean into a British lake. The domination of Britain, having won its wars against the European rivals, saw the establishment of a comprehensive structure under the British aegis. And the combination of British Royal Navy and the resources of the undivided subcontinent together produced the resources and the sole superpower was in alignment with the biggest region of the Indian Ocean, produced a set of conditions under which the stability, security could be organized under a broad single framework. And that phase collapsed, of course, after the British left, the partition of the subcontinent, and the decolonization across the Indian Ocean region. And we saw for almost last 60, 70 years, a period of fragmentation. The attempts, of course, there were attempts to construct a single architecture, but I think the fragmentation it was quite serious. And today what we're seeing is really the emergence of a new phase in which is what the book looks at, of how do we deal with the new phase. And I think it looks at a number of factors that are shaping the region. One, of course, the most important being the rise of China. Historically, we had all the great powers coming from Europe, from the West into the Indian Ocean. Now we have an Asian power. This is not the first Asian power. The Japanese tried, couldn't succeed, but today China is coming into the region. And unlike Japan, China is a much bigger, much stronger economy today, and it brings in its own weight into the Indian Ocean. We've also seen how China's Belt and Road Initiative, its land and sea components intersect in the Indian Ocean, especially in the subcontinent. So therefore, what we have, while we think of the BRI as two segments, are both in some ways come together to this region. The book also looks at the return of Europe in some form. Although they frame it as Indo-Pacific, the potential European role is coming back, having left the Indian Ocean in the post-colonization phase. They're coming back in some form. One of the chapters in the book looks at it. And then you have actually the rise of the Gulf and the Middle East, and the emergence of a number of other middle powers who are reshaping the region. I think we are in the Middle East Institute. I'll just say a word. I think the Gulf is deeply underestimated. The dramatic expansion of Gulf capital is already producing its effects all across the Indian Ocean. And the countries of the Gulf seem to do what France and Britain used to do in the past, interfere in other countries, send in armies, build foreign ports, everything we see happening from the Middle East today. So I think that one of the contributions of this book is to really look at the emergence of the Gulf. And it also draws in Africa into the discussion on the Indian Ocean. I know some of our African friends call it the Afrasian Ocean, but it's here, I think in India and South Asia, we don't pay enough attention to Africa's centrality to the Indian Ocean. I think one of the things the book does is to bring in. And the book looks at the larger question of potential security architectures in the Indian Ocean. So I think this is really a welcome addition, and we really look forward to listening from Frédéric and Jean-Loup on the book. And then they'll speak for about 10, 12 minutes each, and then we'll go for the discussion after that. Frédéric.
Thank you very much, Raja, and thank you all for being here today. I'm impressed and a bit surprised by both the quantity and the quality of the audience on top of it. Let me just say a few words about the book again. This is a book which is part of a process. This is a book that we wrote while sitting in different part of the Indian Ocean, different part of the world, actually. And for both of us shifting points, we started talking about it when I was in DC and Jean-Loup was in Abu Dhabi. We continued when I was in Paris and Jean-Loup was here in Singapore and so on. And we never saw each other during all that time because COVID made sure that we did not talk to, well, we did talk to one another, but we did never really sat down together to work on the book and actually exchange ideas, or not the way we would have liked to. So at the same time, this is a book which benefited from COVID, because the good point is that it gave everybody time to write, and we were no exception. And this is also a book which suffered from COVID, because although we had connection in the entire region, or at least part of the, for some part at least, especially Africa, partial connection with the region, we certainly don't pretend that we knew everything and we had all the perspective in the region as much as we would have liked to. And from that perspective, then COVID affected the book. What we would have probably gained from such interview is a more prospective view as to what part of the region are actually doing, the way they look at it. Now, this is, as I said earlier, the provisional and the very provisional conclusion of a reflection which is still ongoing. Even between the time that we started writing the book and the time that we actually sent it to the publisher and so on, a number of things happened, and more to the point, thematic change. Or if they didn't change, they're important, the nature of the thematic change. And as Raja said, when we studied the book, the Indo-Pacific debate was in full mood. In any case, Raja had already published Samudra Matan, and we could not ignore it. So it was not out of this that we didn't really speak about it. But we did decide to focus specifically on the Indian Ocean for at least 3 reasons. The first was that they were already concerned about having not enough Indo in the Indo-Pacific. So it was interesting to look at it. Second, there was not many books written on the region. There had been a flurry of books, at least in Europe, on the Indian Ocean in the early 80s, then a little bit in the mid 2000, and nothing in between. So it was perhaps worth considering what was happening, since precisely many things had been happening. It was also obvious already at that time that the Indian Ocean was much less structured than the Pacific, and was to a large extent looking for a structure of its own. There were many attempts, particularly by India, which certainly was the most active of all the actors in the region, to do things. But I mean, we felt, at least rightly or wrongly, that it was still in a search for something which was not yet completely finalized. And from our perspective, we're both Europeans, so we understood already, even before the publication of the Europe Strategy for Cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, that the Indian Ocean was indeed Europe's gateway to the Indo-Pacific. It was at the time obvious for us French. It was much less obvious for a number of Europeans, and I dare say that it's still not that obvious for a number of Europeans yet. However, irrespective of whether we did consider the Indian Ocean in isolation or as part of the Indo-Pacific, there were new dynamics emerging. This is what we try to focus on. If we look at the Indian Ocean in the first decade of the century, what do we see? We see, as Raja indicated, a space which is politically at least very fragmented. We can argue about an Indian Ocean culture and all those things, and it certainly exists. There have been interaction between the various sides of the Indian Ocean for centuries. But politically, this is a space which is politically very, very fragmented. Second, when we discuss about security, we have a clear distinction between hard security and soft security, between, and if we look at it again in the first decade of the century, is the core of the discussion, or we discuss mostly of piracy. But we're also just about to witness a transformation of all that. Piracy, first of all, was the beginning of a new phase, the arrival of China in it. I mean, if China came to Djibouti, it's because he was nicely invited by all our Anglo-Saxon friends to visit and establish himself and be part of the piracy, the fight against piracy, which they nicely did for themselves and for nobody else. But they established a base which was much bigger than anybody else base in the region. And by far, if you compare the French base, for example, and the Chinese one, we're talking of base of 10,000 for 10,000 people in the Chinese one. This is something huge and which was bound to have consequences beyond simply what it was initially meant for. But we also, everything changed with the arrival of China. Piracy became something else. So we no longer had how could I say? We no longer had a clear distinction between what was the common good and what was national interest, because everything was mixed, because every single sub-strategic issues became the opportunity to pursue strategic interests, to transform it into something which had nothing to do with the initial phase. Today, if we look at the Indian Ocean, piracy is no longer really an issue. And if you look at all insurance company, then the Indian Ocean is no longer a region at risk. But IU fishing is. That's interesting. Who would have said not so long ago that IU fishing would become an issue, and a strategic one in the Indian Ocean too? People here probably knew it because it had been a problem in the South China Sea for decades. This was not the case so far in the Indian Ocean. Today, you ask everybody from Iran to South Africa, and they all complain about Chinese IU issue, IU fishing. The reason why I did mention those two is not just because they are the extreme geographically, it's also because they are both allied with China, which means that even allies of China can complain about China practices in the region. Now, beyond the fact, I mean, China is obviously not the only country to practice IU fishing. China transformed the nature of it because it did use it for strategic purposes, for territorial claim and so on. Not in the same way that in the South China Sea. It couldn't have the same claims in the Indian Ocean, but it used it nevertheless for political purpose and quite effectively. So, you know, what I'm trying to get at is that we went from problems which are basically law and order issues affecting the whole region to one degree or another, to something which became really strategic and transforming not the way we look at them, but also the way we look at each other. Because if everybody becomes the opportunity to pursue strategic purposes, then how can you build trust? What is what are the limitations? What are the definition of everything? You know, trade used to be something else than just what it is now. it has now become the strategic issue by excellence in a way. Look at the discussion around CREP, look at the discussion of around CPTPP and so on. So we started seeing that emerging in the Indian Ocean as well. So Raja has already spoken about the BRI. I won't mention it again. This is also part of this larger issue that I was mentioning. Building infrastructure becomes a strategic problem. It doesn't become a strategic problem. It becomes a strategic problem irrespective of the nature of the infrastructure which is being built. We used to distinguish between critical infrastructure and non-critical infrastructure. From a strategic perspective, this no longer exists because this is basically about investment to build infrastructure. Then investment means debt, then debt means dependency, and dependency means whatever the creditor wants it to become. And when this is in a period of polarization like the one that we are now, this is of course becoming something else. Of importance and adding to the regional conundrum was also, rightly or wrongly, the fear that the role of the US would fade away. And this is a fear, I'm afraid, which has not totally disappeared, which generated a frantic search for partnership, increasing in the process the interconnection between the various subregions of the Indian Ocean. So in a way, the interesting phenomenon that we looked at or tried to look at and was that China's presence was a vector for many things, some of which was polarization on one side, but also greater unity through the polarization. And therefore, the fragmentation that we're discussing initially was still there, but less and less, so in different ways. So based on this consideration, and that will be my last few points, we try to look at the possibility of a meaningful security architecture allowing for the management of regional emerging tensions. I mean, it will surprise nobody if I say that that's probably in the Indian Ocean that the security architecture is the least developed in the Indo-Pacific. At least there is nothing comparable to what we have in the Pacific, and certainly something insufficient, not for lack of trying, but because of the level of development of a number of states in the region. When you look at a partner in the Indian Ocean, you basically look at India and you look at India. And at the margin, you talk to Singapore because Singapore looks mostly to the east, Indonesia looks mostly to the east, and so on and so forth. And you wonder about the position of Africa and what you can do with your African partner. And you have really no answer. So this is the set of problems that are set. I mean, every cooperation is based A, on the availability of strategically meaningful partners, B, on the level of political trust. In the Indian Ocean, you don't have much of these two factors anyway. So this is one of the problems we saw. Needless to say that in this context, IORA is certainly something that could eventually become useful, but so far it's still a docking shop. And docking shop which is happy to remain this way because precisely this is a way to manage the tension at the low level, but not to produce anything practical, but that kind of, and there is something comparable in a way with the spirit, at least in which the EU was created, in the sense that it's very much in the DNA of IORA to avoid every temptation for power politics. And I'm, of course, avoiding the discussion on the capacities there, but at least the way it's framed makes sure that nothing will happen anyway. And this is probably one of the challenges that we meet today in trying to give it some more substance than it has had in the past. So what we started looking at in the book is also the new format that were emerging. I mean, you're all specialists of the region, you're all specialists in international relations, so those new formats are not so new. But multilateral didn't exist so long ago. Multilateral tends to multiply these days. Multilateral tend to unite countries which have a convergence of interest and capacity that can complement each other. And you don't find that everywhere, again, in the Indian Ocean. So, but at the same time, this is a way to make sure that gradually whatever larger structure exists in the Indian Ocean can be fed by those smaller formats. And this is probably a way to go. So we try to imagine the other book, security architecture, which would link at the same, at various levels, the all those architecture. They would overlap with each other. They would be interlinked. They would never necessarily correspond with the objective of one another. But at the end of the day, they would create something in which comparable to what Samaan used to call a network of a web of webs. Yes, call it if I remember his expression well. This is something that is in the making, and that's also why we say that the book is in the middle of something, a process which is still continuing, which outcome, by the way, is still uncertain in many ways.
Thanks.
Thank you, Frédéric. So I'll come back here to the initial question, and as Frédéric gave the big picture on the book, the origin of the book, and in a way the conclusion of the book. What I'll do is actually look at one specific case, which is the Gulf states. And the reason why we wanted also to have one case here is that the origin of the book, as was mentioned before, was the fact that we were witnessing two trends in the Indian Ocean. One, which is the most well-known, the most reported, which is this strategic competition or great power competition, namely between the US, China, India. And although we cannot ignore that that idea of the Indian Ocean as an arena for competition between powers, we always felt like this is a frustrating narrative, because the second trend we were identifying was that more and more you have states, literal states of the Indian Ocean, that have their own ambitions, that claim their own agency. And we were frustrated, especially with, let's say, the think tank or policy narrative in the West or elsewhere that was looking mostly at the Indian Ocean through that lens of great power competition. And in a way, the Indo-Pacific narrative only exacerbates that tendency to look at the region only through that lens. So the book tries as much as possible to reconcile these two trends, to say that yes, it's about that competition, this deepening of the competition between the three main powers in the region. But you add another layer of complexity when you consider that at the same time, you have all these little states that are claiming to become middle powers or to have their own agency, as I said earlier. And this is also, let's say, the puzzle, the research puzzle here, the fact that you have these two trends at the same time. And that's where the Gulf states get into the equation for us. And what's interesting to discuss it in 2023 is that the topic of the Gulf countries, and here I'll be talking mostly about Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, the UAE. This is something that would not have really been discussed, let's say, 10 years ago. But more and more in the last years, we've seen these countries discussed in the framework of the Indian Ocean. Historians would say that there has always been ties between the Gulf and the Indian Ocean for different reasons in terms of demographics and the human migration trends, whether we're talking about Gulf, Horn of Africa movements, but also Gulf South Asian movements that didn't start with the oil boom in the 70s, but it was already there in the early 20th century because of the pearl business. There's also the cultural religious aspect. The fact that, in a sense, when you go to the Gulf, they perceive a common tie through the religious aspect, and namely Islam. But for us, we were not so much interested in these cultural human ties, but how in the past 10 years, Gulf rulers turned these ties into strategic ambitions. And you can see that in particular in the Horn of Africa, in South Asia, and beyond that between the Gulf-China ties. What we've seen over the last 10 years, as I said, is Gulf countries becoming political military actors in the Horn of Africa, something that was not really the case before. In particular, after the beginning of the war in Yemen, you had both Saudi Arabia and the UAE opening military bases in the Horn of Africa, in Eritrea, in Somalia, and with a project for Saudi Arabia to open a military base in Djibouti, which is still not open, but there's this project. In addition to that, so there was a very operational dimension here. The Gulf countries were launching amphibious operations on Yemen. They needed to do that from the Horn of Africa. But they were also investing in the local armed forces. And more, we saw how the Horn of Africa was impacted by the power plays between Gulf countries, and in particular between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, or between the UAE and Qatar. That's one aspect. The other element that we saw during that same period is how Saudi Arabia and the UAE looked at India differently. In particular, after the arrival of Narendra Modi. For a long time, when we were discussing Gulf-India relations, this was mostly about the presence of the Indian workers, the presence of the Indian diaspora in the Gulf. But Modi, in a sense, created a new momentum for the relations between Gulf and India, with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia calling Modi now his, I think he called him his older brother, which could sound extremely odd given let's say the domestic politics of Modi. But what's interesting is that suddenly this was not just about business, not about just the Indian diaspora. There was a strategic element to that. And another element that added maybe complexity to that is that the Gulf countries also looked more and more towards China, exactly during the same period. And this was, in a way, the Xi effect, and in particular, the BRI effect. What's interesting here is that we are talking about countries, the Gulf states, that for decades were anchored in the US orbit. And you could argue in the Western orbit for centuries in a way. But in the case of the US, they still rely until today heavily on US military presence, on US security guarantees. But what we witnessed during the writing of the book is that Gulf countries were testing red lines, testing the red lines of Washington, looking or selecting Chinese company Huawei for the 5G network. Huawei is providing the 5G network for the 6 Gulf states. But it also involves a military dimension with arms sales between China, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE. I mean, we're not talking about advanced platforms. We're talking about drones, ballistic missiles, and more recently, light fighter jets. But again, this is a trend where you can see countries that were traditionally clearly siding or aligned on the US agenda, moving towards China. In addition to that, Frédéric mentioned the minilaterals, something that happened or emerged during the final phase of the book was how Gulf countries were also part of that minilateral phenomenon. In particular, the UAE is part of the I2U2 framework. So this is a terrible acronym for those of you who are not familiar with this one. So I2 for India, Israel, U2 for United States, United Arab Emirates. And something that has been called sometimes the Quad of the Middle East. Although the UAE tried to downplay the China dimension behind the I2U2 framework, because again, that would go against the UAE's own engagement with China. Interestingly, the UAE is also involved in another minilateral or trilateral, whether we want to call it, which is the emerging one between France, UAE, and India. So all of that also means that Gulf countries want to become significant players of the Indian Ocean. Now, I'd like to finish on one question mark, which is not just for the Gulf states, but I would say for a lot of the countries in Southeast Asia, but also in Africa, when it comes to these ambitions, which is the obvious question: how can they sustain that level of ambition? For those countries, for the Gulf countries, there are two challenges. The first one is the military capabilities, the military resources. It's one thing to say that we want to be players in the Indian Ocean, but this has to translate into capabilities. What we see is that those are countries with very limited naval capabilities. So when it comes to operations such as counter-piracy or any major initiative in the Indian Ocean, Gulf states cannot really provide much. In addition to that, what we saw is that after the reduction of the war efforts in Yemen, most of the military bases that Gulf countries opened in the Horn of Africa have been either reduced or just closed, because they cannot afford to have like permanent military bases there. That's the first challenge. The second challenge, which is maybe even trickier, is the diplomatic resources. Gulf states have tremendous ambitions for very small states. But at the end of the day, they face the challenge of translating the big goal or the major goal that rulers have for their countries at the working level, meaning at the level of ministries of foreign affairs. And that's usually where the initiatives tend to slow down or just to be on hold. And we see that on several aspects. And for instance, that's something that will be a big challenge when you have all these new initiatives at minilateral level, multilateral level, because this is something that is very consuming for diplomats. And when you have countries with very limited resources in terms of personnel, human resources, they have to make choices. And what we see is that they tend to go to the traditional, the safest choice, which is still to rely on bilateral relations with their traditional allies. But again, I used this snapshot on the Gulf states just to illustrate one tendency, one phenomenon, which is this rise of new states or new actors in the Indian Ocean. And I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Thanks, Jean-Loup. I think we've had a good set of comments on introducing the book. So before I open the floor, I just wanted to ask one question to both of you, which is, you point to two different tendencies, right? One is the great power competition or the strategic competition between US, China, and India, and the rise of greater agency for regional actors. But these two don't operate separately, right? I mean, there is a dynamic interaction. Maybe you can say how that interaction you think will play out, I mean, in terms of coalition building, in terms of alliances, partnerships.
Well, it's linked to what I was describing in terms of what is actually today a strategic issue. And it's changing radically the perspective. I mean, Jean-Loup was, or maybe you mentioning the comeback of the European power and the thing. European power may come back, but nobody will come back in the region in the same way. This is all about cooperation today. The major problems we see in the Indian Ocean all over the place is the protection of not just territorial waters, but also exclusive economic zones. And the real problem that we face is that very few countries have the capacities and the capabilities to do so. So this is where the link is established. And this is where we do have a problem because existing institutions are in no way capable, today at least, to provide for that kind of A capacities and B capabilities. My belief is, my knowledge that there will be effort made in that direction, but we're not there yet. And this is really the key issue, and this is likely to remain the key issue for some time.
Want to add something?
Yeah, I think the two reactions we see to this combination of the trends is at the level of the little states or the small states, they can use positively the strategic competition as a way to attract more for their own benefit. And you can see that some of the states play it smartly to attract China, which in a way is a way also to send a message to Washington. I think that's one phenomenon which is increasingly happening in the area where the US had the monopoly in terms of security partnerships, in terms of multilateral cooperation. And so again, when we look at this, this is interesting to see that those countries are courting China also in a way to send a message to Washington. At the level of the US-China competition, I think China has also used that that desire for agency as a way to exacerbate the tensions between the US and its allies. And the most obvious case was probably the latest deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which China facilitated. It was a very opportunistic intervention, I would say, from China, because most of the diplomatic work had been done before. China probably only intervened late in the process, but it was a good way also for both Saudi Arabia, which was sending a message to the US, and for China to send another message. Meanwhile, I fear that this idea of the agency of the local states is not yet either understood or accepted in the US. When I say that, I mean particularly in the policy circles in Washington, where there's a tendency to look at this as a zero-sum game and to say that those states have to abide by the rules of their main patron or their main partner, which is the US. So especially when you look at the Saudi-Iran deal, this was received with a lot of emotion in the US, and with the idea that they didn't accept, in a sense, that agency of the local actors.
Gentlemen, the floor is open. So, yeah, could you just introduce yourself?
First and foremost, congratulations on the book. It's difficult to talk about the book before reading it, so I will not attempt it now, but I will definitely do so. And I have to say that I'm very pleased to see that the Indian Ocean was finally defined as a security region. At first hearing, I have some doubts when you define it as a political region, simply because to me, the players in the region are a bit heterogeneous. Honestly, I don't see too much common ground between them, but maybe the book proves me wrong. My question is that we are coming across a new designation, the Indo-Pacific, which I find personally a little bit arbitrary, because no question about the Indian Ocean being compact in many ways, primarily, historically, culturally, geographically, no question. But to pair this with the vast and huge and culturally very different Pacific region, I think it's a tall order. What do you think about this designation? Thank you.
I think is one of the core questions.
Well, personally, absolutely no problem with the designation, because, you know, when we speak of the Indo-Pacific, we don't speak of a geographical concept. We speak of a strategic one. So strategically, it does make sense to link up the two oceans. Of course, there will be differences between the two spaces, and within the two spaces, the various region and sub-region and so on. But this is not primarily a geographical thing. And this is at the core of one of the major misunderstandings that we see in the literature today. But I mean, if you accept it as strategic concept, I mean, this is meant to do three things, basically, for most of the countries who are checked it. A, manage, and I insist on the term manage, so there is no notion of hostility a priori, the rise of China to start with. This is one key issue. The second one is definitely maintain as much as you can US security guarantees wherever you can get them. Third, avoid being trapped in the current polarization between the US and China. And therefore, you need to define it by yourself. But again, if you say that, it means that whoever defines it will define it differently from its neighbors. So, you know, there's notion whether it should extend to the Pacific or not. And if you look at the various definition, if you look at what the Australians, for example, put in the concept, what the Europeans put in the concept, or even what the Americans actually put in the concept, and that's where I don't disagree with Jean-Loup, but where we could add a little caveat. Actually, the Americans are not that interested in the Indian Ocean anymore. Some of them see why it's important, but I mean, the focus is definitely on the Pacific, and the tendency is to focus all strength on the Pacific. So we are there in various configurations, which are perfectly legitimate by themselves. They just reflect national interest of the states. But I mean, per se, the beauty of the concept, it does allow for cooperation, complementarity, and so on. But it is not focused on the Indian Ocean, the Pacific, and this is just a geographical translation of something else.
You want to add anything?
No, I think Frédéric already covered most of the thing. The problem with the Indo-Pacific, and I remember, I think, I forgot the name of the commentator that argued when the concept emerged in the US that the Indo part was just adding India. It didn't add really the Indian Ocean. And if you look at, because the most concrete implication was for the regional commands of the US Armed Forces. And if you look at it, most of the Western Indian Ocean is still covered either by the African Command or the Central Command. So we go back to the idea that this emphasizes the idea of the strategic competition between the US and China, and including India in the US narrative. So that's, but again, as Frédéric said, we're not talking about like geographical concepts. These are concepts which are used, especially when you have to go to the Congress to promote reorganization of your military commands and to ask for resources. So that would be my
thanks. Yeah, at the back, can you just introduce? Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm Peter Guschebar, the ambassador of Austria here in Singapore. Coming from a small landlocked country, I nevertheless have a few questions about the Indian Ocean. My first question would be, it's from my personal background because I've been posted to India about 15 years ago. And so it's a great pleasure to see Raja Mohan again. I would like to ask, at that time, the string of pearls theory was, there was a lot of excitement around that. And you just mentioned how some of these strategic concepts, they are, if you need resources or if you want to promote ideas, you need a snazzy title. So string of pearls was such a term from the past. How do you see this playing out in the light of the developments that have taken place over the past 10, 15 years? Is that still a danger that is seen, that there will be a number of bases? There was some real panic. I remember some years ago that this might all happen very quickly, but that was clearly not the case. And my second question would be, you've mentioned that there are very few actors actually in or around the Indian Ocean that bring ambitions, or even fewer who bring capacities to the table. How do you see Australia in that context? There has been a lot of waves recently about Australian capacities or future Australian capacities for the Pacific. Is that also of relevance to the debate for the Indian Ocean? And thank you very much for the interesting book discussion. Thank you.
Let me add, there is a question from the Zoom audience on Australia. At the time of print, Frédéric and Jean-Loup could not have foreseen and articulated the impact of defense and strategic review, this is about the Australian, in the Indian Ocean. As the most significant update of defense planning in 40 years of the Australian Defence Forces, what would they add or update in chapter 7 in terms of the new developments in Australia? Maybe you can tag it along with the other questions.
Well, the string of pearls, I mean, that's a question for you, because you have answered that many times over, observing in particular that, you know, there was a clear disconnect between what Buzz Hamilton described as the pearls of the string and so on. I think what's interesting in that is the dynamic that it created. There was clearly an element, purely domestic element, US element in it. I mean, this is a contractor for the US government, which of course is trying to maximize its benefits and used it. Nevertheless, part of the dynamic is very much there. I mean, look at the struggle for influence between India and China in all the various small islands of the Indian Ocean, and you do have the answer. Nobody is very comfortable today with what's happening with Ambatota. Us as Europeans first, although, I mean, I would love the Europeans to realize it a little more, because Sri Lanka is just on a straight line between Bab el Mandeb and Malacca, and therefore would make sense if the expression protecting the sea lane of communication has any meaning, to start working seriously on that and try to do things which would matter for the region. But clearly, this is exactly what we are talking about. So it doesn't matter whether the string of pearls was just that. It was a very catchy phrase. It's still a very catchy phrase. I mean, the dynamic is still there. Now, in this, it would suggest that there was a level of planification which maybe was not there at the beginning. That is true also for Sri Lanka again, because Ambatota was not supposed to be built initially by China. It's not to China that the Sri Lankan asked first, and so on. So, but at the same time, I mean, now things are crystallizing in a different way. So that's where we are. So does it still mean something? Yes and no. The limits being what I just described now. The question about Australia was, sorry?
He's talking the same thing as the Australian review of its options, creating new long-range capabilities. AUKUS. I mean, well, Australia has become
the Australian review was creating long-range capability for the Americans in the Pacific. If we look at the actual, the nature of the contract that is ongoing, the point here is not because we were talking of the nuclear propelled submarine, then we're talking of all the rules about non-proliferation and so on. And therefore, we're not talking of technology transfer of any kind. And this is very public. This was in the New York Times not so long ago and so on. That means a kind of relationship between Australia and the US that did not exist to the same extent before, that is still looking primarily at the Pacific. Will it have consequences in the Indian Ocean? I don't know. I don't know exactly what the Australians are planning to use those for, but I mean, this is something else. Now, what's interesting with Australia is that there is a gradual reconnaissance of the importance of the Indian Ocean. I mean, not so long ago, the Australians looked exclusively at the Pacific. Today, when they speak of the Indian Ocean, they still speak primarily of the Northern Indian Ocean because their bases are cocoa and Christmas, but not much about the other part of it. Nevertheless, there is a growing consciousness of it, which has not yet materialized, except for one thing, which is the kind of agreement that Australia is currently developing with India in many ways, and which details I don't know. But I mean, this is an indication. I mean, the fact that they are willing to resume the dialogue with the French, for example, goes in at the same time in the direction. I mean, this is still primarily about the Pacific because that's where we have the most common interest there. But I mean, there is also an Indian Ocean dimension which is present, but which is still to be developed and defined.
You wanted? Yeah. Okay. Ambassador Shivshankar Menon? Yeah. No, yeah, no. You want to ask?
You want to? Go ahead. Thank you for a fascinating introduction to a book we obviously must read. But I was wondering, this framework that you've developed of great power rivalry and the agency of littoral states, how does that apply to the Bay of Bengal?
Well, this is a question that you should answer, not us, because the big power there is definitely India, because of your position in Andaman and Nicobar to start with. It does apply in connection with the custodian state of the Malacca Strait, I mean, of the strait in general, that is Singapore, of course, Malaysia, Indonesia, and so on. So this is what we see, and we are in Singapore, so there is no need to underline the strong European, American presence. That's the way I think it works mostly in the area, but I'm willing and ready to be corrected.
Okay, Ambassador Kudyshev? Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir. Well, my name is Nikolai Kudyshev. I'm Russian ambassador to the Republic of Singapore. I was also once or twice posted to the dreamland of India, and I keep best memories of this outstanding country. I've got one question only. Well, in Moscow's take, these are the last days of the world of colonialism. The new layout is emerging, a new multipolar, multilateral system. The system is there already. So whether it really makes sense to try to place the Indian Ocean region into the rigid formula of Indo-Pacific, or whether we need a larger layout, larger formula of the Eurasian partnership, bringing together Russia, SCO, India, China, and the IORA countries to fit the growing aspirations of the regional countries, big or small. Thank you so much, sir.
But sir, be careful, because if you include the IOR countries, now you include us as well. So you may not be that happy about it.
Anything to add on this? Okay. But I think one of the things we didn't do in the book is always easy to criticize authors for what they've not done. Really, I mean, the Russian role in the Indian Ocean, I mean, in many ways, I think just as the Europeans are coming back, the Russians too, as a major arms supplier in Africa, actually, I don't know if you deal with it in the Africa chapter, but really the Russian presence is today a pretty impressive one. And while they don't bring in the kind of economic heft that the Chinese bring, but they certainly bring a lot of military capabilities. And certainly they've taken eaten the French lunch in Africa. So.
Well, let's see about that, because a closer examination, so they haven't really taken a French lunch. And there are two parallel dynamics, which are the decline of our ill-thought policies on the one side, which do not necessarily correspond with the push of Russia on the one side. But this is true that we could have and probably should have, honestly, include some consideration about Russia. Yeah, you know, at the same time, it's not clear the way we could have done it. If we look, I mean, the most obvious thing which come to my mind, if we speak of Russia is Comoros on the one side, is the Mozambique on the other one. And in the Mozambique, we see what? We see essentially mercenary society operating for God knows whom. We don't know because, of course, the Russian state denies any involvement in that. And in the Comoros, this is a very different story. In the Comoros, I mean, Minister of Foreign Affairs Lavrov has condemned twice the role of France and so on and so forth. Wonderful. What Russia has actually brought to the country, I still want to see it. And I'm sure the Comorian would love to see it. Now, beyond the condemnation of colonialism and so on, which is wonderful, except that the real problem is the decolonization, not the other way around. And let me say that this is a much more difficult process than coming into the same thing, especially when there is a democratic vote behind it, such as Mayotte, which voted twice in favor of remaining in France. This is very difficult. So which way should we have addressed the Russian role? I'm not too sure about that. Could we have addressed it? Yes, probably. We probably didn't have the what it requires to do something really, really interesting. But I would love to have your view, sir, about this, the Russian role in the region and the Indian Ocean.
We'll come back.
Can I add just,
Yeah, sure.
I mean, because we actually look very indirectly at Russia's role, but mostly from an historical point of view. What was interesting actually when we wrote on the evolution of the US perception on the Indian Ocean is that for a long time, actually, during the Cold War, the Indian Ocean was actually simply looked through the lens of the US-Soviet Union competition. And in a way, we go back to this idea that it was always seen through the lens of great power competition that was just replaced in a sense by the US-China competition. Apart from that, as Frédéric said, we had to make some choices. I'll share the skepticism in the sense that, for instance, I talked about Gulf countries, and this is an area where usually, where in the last years, there has been a lot of talks on the growing ties between Russia and Gulf states. At the same time, in terms of the volume, trade volume or military cooperation, this is extremely modest. So, and this is not to dismiss the relations, obviously, but just to say that, again, because we had to make choices and our publisher wanted to stick to 80,000 words, we had to ignore some of the countries. But again, we do have a few mentions in the book on Russia.
Thanks. Dr. Sinderpal Singh?
From Sinderpal from Rajaram School. Thank you. I think firstly, the point is well made that, you know, there's very little like single authored or even edited books on the Indian Ocean. I teach a master's level course at the Rajaratnam School on Indian Ocean security. So this is probably going to go on the reading list. So thank you for that. I just got 3 or 4 kind of very brief kind of questions, reflections. The first is Dr. Samaan talked about agency of the Saudi Arabian case. Surely you can talk about that without using the analytical category of the Indian Ocean, right? The US-Saudi Arabia relationships, you can talk about it without talking about the Indian Ocean. So firstly, I wonder what does it do for the, and that leads to the second point. The Indian Ocean region is actually quite unique because it's nearly completely defined by its maritime orientation. We don't have any kind of counterpart to them, right? which then leads to the third point, which is the referent of security is very important, right? And here you got a big split. Raja and me, I think Raja more than me, we involved in a lot of track 2 conversations at IORA level. And you can always see the split in the room. Some people talking about IUU fishing, rising water level. Some states say, oh no, great power competition. So here the referent of security is a very interesting debate, which then leads to my fourth point, which is for better or for worse, there's been a collapse now between treating traditional and non-traditional security matters separately, largely because things like IUU fishing now can be traced back to one state. Overfishing can be traced back to one state. It used to be that non-traditional security was not a threat, not coming from a specific state. So I don't know what that does for your book or for your analysis, but I thought that was a very interesting point, that somehow the boundaries are becoming collapsed. Thank you, Raja. Thanks.
You want to start this time?
So I'll address the first question on agency, and it's a great question because it actually provides us the ability to go deeper into the analysis of the book. And you're right to say that the idea of those states have agency doesn't imply explicitly anything for the Indian Ocean in itself. What we explain in the book is that it has several implications. First, when those states have greater ambitions in terms of the governance of the Indian Ocean. One example, and while we were writing the book, the UAE was chairing the Indian Ocean Rim Association. And this was, I think, the second time in 2 or 3 decades that they did that. And the UAE played a significant role to support the French application to the association. So that's a typical example where you see that one of the small states has ambitions that are not just having implications for its own foreign policy, but for the collective, the regional level. In a sense, we cannot discuss governance in the Indian Ocean without factoring in these new ambitions. The second aspect, which is even more complex in a sense, is that those new states or those new actors can also interfere in other sub-regions of the Indian Ocean. And again, using Gulf states, we saw that in the Horn of Africa, how they meddled with the local competition in Somalia or Eritrea and Ethiopia. But you could argue also that the way Saudi Arabia and the UAE are increasingly siding with India had an effect on Pakistan. And the way Saudi Arabia and the UAE started supporting diplomatically Indian strikes after, I forgot, I think it was in 2017 or 16, something that they would not have done in the past. But again, why I mentioned that is that these new ambitions have implications for other sub-regions of the Indian Ocean. So that's why we connected the idea of agency with the level of Indian Ocean governance.
You want to say something? No, actually.
Well, on IUU fishing, first of all, I disagree. This is not just about one country. I mean, first of all, if we speak of Somalia, Somalia has been the mother of all problems in the region for some time. Initially, there was not the Chinese. The Chinese came in to fight piracy, not to. Now the situation is reversed because they wonderfully signed an agreement for 100 boats fishing in Somalian waters and about 1,000 roughly. This is the magnitude. No, the specificity of China that is using this activity as a way to pursue strategic objectives. Now, there is something interesting to observe, and this is just a correlation, not necessarily a causality. But, you know, the decision to subsidize heavily long-distance fisheries in China was decided about the same time than the BRI. And this is all under Xi Jinping. I'm not saying that this is the only reason that we should be some sort of a larger strategy, let alone conspiracy, because there were also reasons for, I mean, Chinese waters were depleted. And the interesting thing is that the Chinese were authorizing anything abroad, but were extremely severe in the way they were managing their own waters for good reason, because they had wonderfully destroyed it for decades. But I mean, you know, there was a dynamic again of that kind that we saw there. As to the link between the two, I mean, that's what I've been trying to describe earlier. This is clearly the blurring of all lines right now. And this applies to a number of things which were totally unrelated to strategic issues before. And that's the major problem we're all confronted with. You know, who cares whether China finance, I don't know, a small port or whatever elsewhere? But I mean, everybody cares if that small port can become a base simply because the dependency is such that the local state will not be able to refuse anything. That's a very different problem. So, you know, that are highly fungible. And that's the problem we collectively face today.
So, yeah.
Thank you. Tim Winter from the Asia Research Institute here at NUS. I'm fascinating talk and a great book, obviously a great contribution. So I'm coming from this from a different discipline, and I'm interested in that idea. Frédéric, you mentioned that you're identifying a clear distinction between hard and soft security, and I'm wondering what that means today in relation to oceans. So we've heard a lot about countries, and I've been reading a lot about, and my head's in the space of ocean ontologies, and you actually take the ocean as your starting point of analysis. So rather than seeing countries and seeing the ocean as a passive actor, we start with the ocean and the ocean in excess and how that reframes global politics and global geopolitics. And we start from that perspective. And actually, I thought it was a gimmick, but actually it's quite a powerful way to rethink what we're talking about. So the High Seas Treaty a few weeks ago, the BBNJ, the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, is now a critical element in kind of the transition to clean energy futures. This is going to be a scramble for the ocean floor. And so that's kind of supposedly taken us a step forward in the global governance kind of quagmire that we've experienced the last few decades from the beginnings of UNCLOS. So in your definitions of security, you've mentioned fisheries, but the ocean in itself, in terms of its volumetric space, it's no longer a kind of surface security discourse. It's a complex space to think through. So what I'm getting at is that what's that distinction between, yes, you mentioned fish, but the ocean has all this water security, food security, energy transition securities, all the types of new ways and we need to think about alliances that are being built around the decade of human ocean, the decade of oceans, sustainable oceans. We're in the second, third year of that, I think. So how does that alliances speak to the ocean itself? I mean, I guess that's a provocation to think, how might that fit into what you're talking about?
So oceanic history.
Exactly. Well, so can I have one final point? Oceanic history is the Indo-Pacific. If you're looking at the Indo-Pacific from an Indonesia, it is absolutely a historical, cultural category. So Indonesia today is pushing a spice phenomena, or spice history, spice future, is a way to see that it's central to Pacific and Indian Ocean histories that puts Indonesia back in a kind of geocultural, geopolitical past and future in exactly the same way as what China's doing with the Belt and Road Initiative and what India's doing with Project Mawson. Absolutely. So yeah, so it depends where you're looking from to kind of construct those imaginaries of past and futures.
So what does happen when China starts digging for lithium and cobalt in the ocean? So that.
Sorry, that was a long point, but.
You want to answer? First of all, I mean, we will face the same. Well, first of all, BBNG is only a step in the right direction. Well, I cannot refrain from noting that fisheries are absent for BBNG, which allows a number of things because what we observe in that specific, and sorry to insist a bit on that, but this is absolutely central, is that you look at the Indian Ocean, it's reasonably well structured when it comes to tuna fish or tuna-like fish, and for nothing else. What used the Chinese arriving for in the international waters, looking for squid, then penetrating markets in a very different way. Now, for every other activity, you will be faced with the same problem that we have been faced before with any matter related to international security. And the ocean have a specificity that they are even more difficult to control than any other space in the world. And they are more difficult to control because, there is nobody to watch. So yes, you can actually satellite, but then even if you see the Chinese mining, what will you really do? And how long before you can move significantly? And how much are you ready to risk in political capital, not even talking of security risk in your relation with China? That's the kind of problem we're going to face with. So yes, BBNG sets some standards, and as such, but the ocean are becoming what you say precisely because of the human factor. I mean, the ocean have sort of an equilibrium by themselves, but they do become an entity potentially influencing human activities through human activities. So I'm not entirely sure that this distinction is, from that perspective, entirely relevant. Which is not to deny the role of the ocean themselves. Certainly not in this as eloquently as you just did, but this is the way I would look at it.
Yeah. Just to follow up, and because I think it's a interesting counter argument. Unfortunately, what we saw in our research is that if this was a shared perspective, organizations such as YORA or the Indian Ocean Commission wouldn't be much stronger, because there would be a shared perception that the ocean should be the center of the cooperation between all the states in the area. In the end, what we see is that most of the security priorities are defined onshore. And when it comes to the discussion, I mean, I'm saying governments perceive this way. I'm not saying this is the right way to look at it, but that as of today, discussion, policy discussion on the ocean is looking at it first with the issues onshore, and the Indian Ocean is seen in a way as the passage for that. I think it was Ashley Tellis who said that the Indian Ocean is first and foremost just a gateway. And I'm not saying that this is a good way, but that also explains why a lot of the actors in the area do not consider that there is this coherent unite or political entity or political complex such as the Indian Ocean. And the reason why there's been this struggle for having regional institutions that would be legitimate and have the capability to promote that type of cooperation. Again, I'm not saying this is what we believe, but that's unfortunately the perception until today from the government.
There I saw Karthik. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Speak into
Karthik Nachipan, ISAS and US. You talked about the agency of Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, UAE. Can you maybe share a little bit more about the other states, Iran, Turkey? What's their role here and how do they fit into your story? Thanks.
It's all for you.
Well, I mean, Iran in particular would be an interesting case here as we talk about the Indian Ocean. Less so for Turkey right now on the spot, but Iran has always had ambitions. It's part of the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium. It has naval ambitions, although again, it's limited resources beyond what they can do in the Strait of Hormuz, or let's say in the Gulf of Oman. But beyond that, yeah, they do have this, especially with the latest deal, because I'm not sure if that's what you're thinking of, the deal with Saudi Arabia and the role of China. What's interesting is that this is a case where Iran had historically strong ties with China since the 80s. And in the last years, there was this assumption that because China is getting closer to the Gulf states, Iran is being marginalized. Iran is no longer on the list of strong partners in the region for China. What we see now is that actually Iran might be benefiting more than Saudi Arabia or any Gulf states from this growing Chinese presence. Because we discussed mostly about how Saudi Arabia is sending a message to Washington. But what China is doing is what Iran has been asking for decades, to marginalize the Americans and from the region. So here you have, I would say that you have another illustration of how one of the local states is exploiting the strategic competition here in particular between the US and China for its own benefit. But again, beyond that, we're talking about a country that has also very limited resources, or struggling with its own resources, diplomatically, economically, or militarily. So what Iran can do beyond its own sub-region will be, I'd say, modest.
Okay. Is there any other questions? Otherwise, I'm going to just offer a few closing comments and I'll bring this to an end. I think we've really had a very, very stimulating discussion. So let me just, I'm not going to sum it up, but at least highlight some of the issues that came up and give my response to that. One, I think in talking about the Indo-Pacific, its evolution as an idea, I think it's important, I think next time you write, when you do the second edition of the book, do put in a bit on Japan, because when you deal with Australia, because it's really, in many ways, it's often underestimated. We don't give much credit to the Japanese, and never been leaders. But today, the entire last 15 years, the Indo-Pacific debate has largely been driven by them. It's really they who conceived this idea of confluence of two oceans, of breaking the paradigm. I mean, that there was an Indian Ocean, there was a Pacific Ocean, to one of actually framing it as a single theme. And they're also the ones who, within the region, are offering competition to China. On the BRI, because Japanese don't have a communist party, so they're not as good in the propaganda. For example, I mean, imagine coming up with a term like PQI. Can you get it off your tongue? It'll be great. Partnership for Quality Infrastructure. They put real money up there, and I think they have a longer history than China or the West in developing infrastructure in this part of the world. And today, now they're talking about their own rearmament, if you will, as well as developing new concepts of deploying their large amounts of economic assistance for strategic purposes, as well as initiating overseas security assistance, which is a new phenomenon, and some of it will flow to the Indian Ocean, especially Bangladesh is on the top of the list. So that covers the Bay of Bengal a bit. So I would say, and then they also into Africa, the so-called TICAD, or the Tokyo International Conference on African Development, is again a part of this network, and I think they have links in the Gulf as well. So I would say Japan's role in the conceptualization and in doing things, shaping the Indian Ocean, I think will be important, and I think that might be a valuable addition. The second thing I wanted to talk about was the expansion and shrinkage in simultaneously. That is, the Indian Ocean becomes the Indo-Pacific, but at the same time, the sub-regions have actually, new sub-regions have emerged, new in a sense for us, relatively new. For example, the idea of Eastern Indian Ocean, which you mentioned Indonesia as the Nusantara that connects, Indian Ocean with the Pacific Ocean, all the sea lines of communication between the two come through the archipelago of Indonesia. So I think this idea of subregions, because you're never going to construct a single architecture, it is going to be interesting how this pans out in the subregions, whether it's the Bay of Bengal, for example. A Chinese, if they develop the Chakpu Island, if they build military facilities on Cocos, if the submarines come into the Andamans on a regular basis, you are going to see a specific responses in specific subregions. So I think it's useful to think of, say, if you start from the corner, the Horn of Africa as a region, we did not think about it in that form. Or even if we go a little further, the Eastern Mediterranean, Israel, Egypt, Greece, France, working against Qatar, Turkey, willing to work with India as well, Cyprus. So you have actually the Eastern Mediterranean tying up with the Horn of Africa region or the Indian Ocean. And then you come to the return of the Mozambique Channel. What was when the colonial powers had to come around Africa. Today, the Chinese search for resources from Africa actually reconnects many of the Western Indian Ocean islands into the debate. And there, I think, again, the Western Indian Ocean as a region, or within that, where France is active, for example, in the Indian Ocean Commission, you hold colonial positions, but nevertheless, they acquire a character today as critical islands which are out for competition within that. And then if we move further, the Arabian Sea, the Bay of Bengal, the Eastern Indian Ocean, every one of these subregions, I think how they interact, and Southern Oceans, we didn't talk about it, but the idea right in the deep south of the Indian Ocean, there again, this dynamic of the strategic competition versus the local agency will, I think, play out. So we need to both think of the Indian Ocean as a whole, as well as its subregions that cut across into the Indo-Pacific. Third, I think there was a question on string of pearls. I think what we're seeing is, irrespective of the phrase, the emerging powers are seeking bases. That, after all, they're doing exactly what the European powers did. That if you become a trading nation, you build a large navy, and since you can't fax a navy to a distant corner, you have to create bases. So I think bases are facilities, bases are natural component of expansion of naval power and projection of naval power. And I think it's going to be inevitable. I mean, now we had the first base, Frédéric talked about Djibouti, the speculation what China might do in Cambodia, a speculation of what they're doing in the South Pacific Islands, the speculation maybe on the east coast of Africa, maybe there'll be another base. So I think so Djibouti is the first and it's certainly not the last. So I think you're going to see a lot more natural consequence of the rise of Chinese maritime power would involve the creation of new bases. We're just at the beginning of that process. And China is not alone. France has a base in the UAE. Russians are trying to have something in Syria. I don't know if there are any other place they have. India too has, euphemistically what we call turnaround facilities, special arrangements where you want to service your navy, move it around. So I would say it is going to be, it's not just the European powers who are going to have bases. We're going to have the local powers also going to get bases. And you mentioned the Gulf countries. The UAE has bases. Turkey has bases. You have Saudi Arabia. So you're going to see a lot more local power projection acquiring, like Somaliland. I mean, outrageously taking possession of a part of another country and declaring it as a separate entity. So we're going to see small countries do big power politics. So I think that's one of the more fascinating aspects of what's happening in the Indian Ocean. So bases is going to be part of life. And there was a time when we used to say nobody should have bases. India doesn't say it anymore. I mean, it tells you something about India's own policy today. The fourth point I wanted to mention was on the burden sharing. That one way the intersection of the strategic competition and local agency plays out is the effort by the US that it doesn't want to do it all by itself, that it wants capable partners. It doesn't want any more passengers on its ship, that it prefers now today to read the national security strategy of the Biden administration, says explicitly they want to have stronger partners who are capable of generating some deterrence of their own. I think the mobilization of Germany in Europe against Russia and the Japan against China is part of that effort to create local capabilities. And I think that principle that they're willing to support the building up of the capabilities of regional powers, so that the structure of a network of coalitions that can come up to build deterrence inside, that means involving transfer of weapons, military capabilities, logistical arrangements. So you can do a whole lot of things without having to put their own boots on the ground to help other countries, local powers to, depends on who, you're going to do it with your friends. Hopefully they'll remain your friends before they turn to the other side. But I think this is a new element that I think that the two processes interact with themselves. And finally, about the Indo-Pacific, I mean, I would say, look, if you cut all the verbiage around it, Indo-Pacific was about putting India into the Pacific. You know, to get India to be part of that coalition. And that's the reason why when the Americans initially talked about Bollywood to Hollywood, was their conception of the Indo-Pacific. I mean, they're trying to modify it a bit, but I think it's quite clearly, it's about drawing India into an Asian coalition to balance China. And that's at least my view. That's not the official, the government of India would never say that, but I think the fact is, the idea of drawing India in is the core strategic purpose. And I think that is rooted in some kind of history. So it's not that, if you go back to the Second World War, it was the Indian Army, nearly 1 million of them, in the Burma campaign, who largely pushed out the Japanese out of Burma, took the surrender of the Japanese troops in Rangoon, in Singapore, Jakarta, and Hanoi. So this, So Saigon, so you have actually so to suggest that India has nothing to do with with the East Asia or the Pacific Ocean, I think is wrong historically, because there was no separation of these two oceans under the British period. You had India, you had China, you had Japan, you had Indochina, you had East Indies or further Indies. So I think these categories of separating them was a post-colonial construction, which involved actually India's withdrawal from the regional security architecture, and India is trying to come back today. But it's not going to be easy for India to be a big player like it was in the Second World War. But I think it is ideas, a growing Indian capabilities. How does it contribute to the regional security in the East? And the Japanese doing more in the Indian Ocean, or the Chinese doing a larger role. Chinese playing a larger role in the Indian Ocean. So that is the shift that is taking place of China coming to the Indian Ocean, India doing a little bit in the Pacific Ocean. That I think is the new combination, and within which there will be a whole lot of new dynamics, as we said, in the Eastern Indian Ocean, etc. So I think we are really into a new phase in this region, and the book, I would say, really helps us to at least begin to think about some of the emerging challenges. I'm not obsessed with architecture, because I don't think you're never going to have architecture gives you a sense of permanence.
But
these things
of constructs all the time.
Yeah. But this is something, it's going to evolve. I mean, it's not, you can't have a design in which you build a house, but a historical process that will unfold. And one of the variables, we don't have control over the domestic politics of these countries as well. So I think, but the book, I think it's, as Sindar said, there's not enough written on the Indian Ocean. I think this is really a valuable contribution. So I want to thank both of you for organizing, and the MEI and the ISAS for organizing this discussion. Please join me in learning.
Thank you.